Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Like Corey mentioned, my name is Joe Williams, and I am a soil health specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, our soil health division. I'm basically from the Portland area, actually in our West Tech Center, but I'm actually up here in Olympia, Washington this morning. So what we're going to talk about today is, we call it 201. And again, that's for we're going to kind of take a little bit deeper dive into kind of more of the soil biology and how it kind of ties into both nutrient management strategies, but also just kind of how everything kind of works. And again, we've got half hour, 45 minutes, so it's not going to be a really extensive deep dive. Just encourage you that if you have an interest in this and how the processes work, all the different soil organisms, how they function and their different roles within the soil framework and the ecosystem. Again, just really encourage you to, if you haven't already done that, really kind of take a dive into that and just do a lot more. There's a lot of great information out there. The exciting part for me regarding soil health and soil biology is that literally the science seems to be changing on a daily basis as we discover new organisms in the soil, also about how those interactions occur. So again, there's still a lot of questions out there that we don't have any the answers to as well too. So again, it's an exciting field. It's been around for a while, but again, it's something that I just encourage you to take more information on this.
We're in 201.
Hey, Scott, you need to mute yourself.
Okay.
Thanks.
So yeah, thanks, Jericho. Just wanted to kind of really talk a little bit about soil health principles, that NRCS kind of promotes. And again, I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this, but again, just want to kind of talk a little bit more about how these function. And again, so what we're looking at is basically two different principles here. We got four different principles, which is minimizing disturbance, maximizing soil cover, and for that we use that as our protecting the soil. And so what we're really talking about here is protecting the soil organic matter that's there in the soil. We're really promoting and protecting the soil aggregates in the system. On the left hand side is maximizing continuous living roots. And we're also, promoting maximizing biodiversity of the system. And so with that, you can see livestock in there as well too. But again, just really maximizing the biodiversity. And so, with that, we're looking at, ideally, a nice complex mix of, of cover crops as an example, where the introduction of livestock into the system, and just introducing and maximizing the biodiversity of that system. And again, maximizing continuous living roots. And so with that, we're calling that feeding and fueling the soil biology. And that's really what I want to kind of talk to you about today. Just kind of do a little bit more of a dive into that. You guys probably have seen this graph before, but it's just kind of pretty important to show, in the fact that 1 acre of healthy soil can harbor up to 27,000 pounds of biomass. Okay, and so we're talking here, 1 hectare of soil contains 15 tons of organisms, which is equivalent to the weight of 20 cows. And so, as part of this example, we're looking at 10,000 pounds of fungi, up to 6,000 to 10,000 pounds of bacteria, 2,700 pounds of algae, up to 1,800 pounds of earthworms, and up to 600 pounds of protozoa and nematodes. And so, there's just, depending on the soil, of course, but, life is teeming in these soils. And so, as we're talking about this, we just really want to kind of take a dive and just get the understanding that, soils are alive, and, that there is a huge ecosystem below the ground and below our feet. And I don't know if you know, but soils host approximately 25% of the Earth's biodiversity. And so, that it's just a huge amount there. And so but the plant, microbe, and the animal interactions, involved in all the soil processes and functions. And so, again, this is just kind of a snapshot of, just some of the different organisms that we'll find in the soil. But again, all these just different interactions that, all these different organisms have, a healthy system. And again, when we're talking about, the herd above ground, we really wanted to kind of, have everyone, understand that, as we're caring for that above ground herd, we also need to take a look and just really kind of manage for the below ground herd as well too, and just kind of realize that there is, that system in place on there. So, wanted to kind of talk real briefly about, again, a lot of this you may know already, but we want to kind of emphasize the fact that there's basically three functional groups with these soil organisms, and so the soil biological community controls all the soil processes and functions that are important for plant productivity. And again, that's kind of what we're talking about today is what's going to be involved in plant productivity and crop production. But they provide multiple ecosystem services, as you can imagine. Soil organisms have co-evolved for hundreds of millions of years and interact, mutualistically as well as negatively. We know, how that works in terms of, some of the diseases and so forth that are out there. But also in this context, we're looking at, predator versus prey in those type of ways. And so conserving this biodiversity, also is going to translate to conservation of important functions and services that the biological community provides. And so keeping in mind that all the soil biodiversity that we're talking about here and the soil functions, they're really complex interactions between, inherent soil properties that we have, climate, management, and the life within the soil. And so this is kind of a simplistic view, categorizing how soil organisms, are broken into the following broad functions. And we'll kind of talk about these a little bit more, but, these include soil ecosystem engineers. And so those were, as depicted here, we're talking about earthworms, pill bugs, those kind of organisms. And so, they are very important for decomposition and carbon cycling, right? And so the next ones we're talking about are going to be the biological regulators. And so we've got, as an example, nematodes, which again, they're going to be interactive in the decomposition, but very important in the carbon cycling and nutrient cycling as well too. And with a multitude of nematodes as an example in a healthy soil, population regulation is going to be very important as well too. And so as you can see, also there's biochemical engineers, and again, those are a lot of the bacteria and ciliates that are, again, really important for decomposition and the carbon cycling. And so as you can see, these arrows, cross among and between the different groups and are an indication that the groups are not exclusive to certain members, and that multiple members can be influential on other functions. But in order to follow some structure and help us understand these key groups, we're going to kind of go through each one of these as we go through there. So let's talk about the ecosystem engineers. And so their main function, again, is to, look and build pore networks and aggregates. And so representative members on here are, again, earthworms, larger invertebrates such as millipedes, centipedes, and beetles, as we're showing here. They tend to be the larger organisms, as well as plant roots also. So we talk about the organisms and a lot of the invertebrates, but again, one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest, is going to be just the plant roots, right? So, and the plant roots and these organisms can modify and create their own habitat, and in doing so create biopores that are important because they're going to channel the air and water. They're mixing organic materials during their burrowing, and they help build resistant soil aggregates. And again, you'll hear me talk about the importance of soil aggregates, and you well know how important they are to this whole process. But by regulating resources and redistributing and regulating access to those resources, these organisms create hotspots that support high numbers of microorganisms. And again, the microorganisms are really what are kind of driving a lot of this. A large source that fuels the entire soil system, are the impacts, again, of those plant roots, which is the first group of ecosystem engineers that, we can kind of discuss. A lot of times are overlooked, right? Where we kind of, really talk about earthworms as being the key representative member of this particular ecosystem engineers. But again, the plant roots are so important on there. And as you well know, plant roots can cause physical weathering as they grow and expand inside cracks in the rocks, as an example. Roots and decaying vegetation produce organic compounds such as solvents, acids, and alkalines that enhance the action of percolating rainwater. And as you well know, there's two types of root systems, fibrous and tap roots. And fibrous roots are the traditional structures formed by primary and secondary roots, branching in all directions in the soil. Contrasting that with the tap roots, which are characterized by a single firm root growing straight down, and they have minor roots developing on either side. There are other specialized roots that do exist, but what we want to kind of point out here is, and particularly on this slide is, and this is getting back to the four principles and discussing the maximizing biodiversity, is this is one way we can maximize biodiversity below ground. Okay, so having a mix of different root structures in the soil, as you can see in that left-hand side of the slide, with that, just think of all the habitat that can be created with a nice mix of different root systems in place there for all these other organisms that are there. So that's the functional group. Yeah.
We've got a couple questions that have come up.
Okay. Sure.
So the first question is, does the name of this group highlight its role in soil physical properties?
Could you, I'm sorry, Jericho, could you say that again?
Does the name of this group highlight its role in soil physical properties?
Yes, to an extent, absolutely.
And then the other question is maybe something that can be answered later, but I'll just ask it now to plant that seed. How do synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides impact these creatures? To what extent can synthetic fertilizers replace these functions? What can they do? What can't they do?
That is an outstanding question, and that'll actually hopefully summarize kind of what we talk about as we go through this presentation. But stay tuned. If I don't answer some of those questions, we'll circle back to that and hopefully get those answered. But yeah, they do have an effect, absolutely. We'll get into that here in a minute.
Great, that's it for now.
Okay, thanks. Good question, guys. So the next functional group that we're going to talk about is the chemical processors. And the chemical processors, as you can see, they kind of regulate 90% of the energy flow in soils, and they're going to build organic matter in the soil aggregates. And so representative members that we're talking about here are soil microbes, such as bacteria, fungi, and protozoa. And so again, these soil microbes are so important for the decomposition of the plant organic matter into the nutrients that are available for plants. And again, that's what we're kind of basing this on. Soil microbes are also responsible for stimulating plant growth, plant protection, and the production of multiple antibiotics used for human and animal health, as you well know. So an incredibly important group of organisms as we talk about here. And so, as represented by the slide, you can see, bacteria in the lower left-hand side there. You're also seeing in the middle there mycorrhizal hyphae growing, so the fungi, and then you got the protozoa on the right-hand side there. Those are the three different representative groups and representative members of this group. But again, just the really important chemical processors, we call them the engineers. And then the next group is the biological regulators. And so the biological regulators include small invertebrates such as the protozoa, nematodes, potworms, springtails, and mites. And through grazing, predation, and parasitism, these organisms regulate the populations of other invertebrates and the microbes. And so, again, they're really important. They're kind of at the little bit higher on the food chain, as it were. But again, they're so important again to regulate the populations of all the other soil organisms as well too. And so you can see the broad diversity of representative members in this particular slide. And just kind of some of their functions too. So again, these are the biological regulators that we're talking about here. So, as we know, there's numerous factors that influence biodiversity, above ground, right? And just, we're talking temperature, we're talking, rainfall, the climate, those kind of things. Well, that's also very similar to below ground too. Okay, so what we're talking about is the fact that there are numerous factors that influence, the activity of soil organisms. Although microbes can exist in the most extreme environments possible, as you guys probably have heard, I mean, up in the Antarctic, down below as well too. But most agricultural soils benefit from the following conditions, as you guys well know. You guys are growers, producers, and work in the industry. But we're looking at near neutral pH, 6 to 7.5. Looking at warm temperatures of the soil, 60 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit as an example. soil water, at field capacity, but also have good aeration in the soil. And so low, that equates to basically, low bulk density of the soils. We're also looking at abundant and diverse food sources too, and diverse, soil pore sizes that all kind of contribute to this. And kind of getting back to the question that we talked about a second ago is minimal contaminants, which include, fertilizers, pesticides, as well as salts too. So, a lot of these organisms are, you see the picture there, they're Goldilocks. We can equate it to Goldilocks as an example. But it's important to realize that, again, just how a lot of the organisms above ground, need these right conditions that are just right. So too do the organisms down below ground as well too. And so, again, another important point to point out is that, basically over 90% of the bacteria in soil are inactive because they've not been able to move toward an organic substrate. There may not be enough water or the water film around the soil particles to actually move around. But they will spring back to life quickly upon re-wetting the soil, and then they're going to be able to redistribute soluble organic carbons and nutrients that way too. So, in general, if we want to encourage a diverse and healthy habitat for microorganisms, we must provide food, nutrients, proper aeration, pH, and water, et cetera, to the microorganisms and to the soil biota that are in there. So, again, just equating this to the fact that, again, as you know about the livestock and how we manage livestock in the herds above ground. Again, these are just things we need to keep in mind for the below ground herd. So, again, microbes are impacted by temperature and moisture. And so the greatest activity in temperate systems occurs generally in late spring and early summer, when the temperature and moisture are optimal for growth. Now, not all organisms are active at a particular time, and some of them remain dormant only to become active later in the season, as you well know. But what this does is this results in a benefit of being stretched out over time. So again, this gets back to having good biodiversity within the soils too, right? So it's not just, you're not getting these initial flushes of bacteria as an example with their activity, and then all of a sudden it dies down for the rest of the year. If we have good bacterial and fungal organisms present in the soil, and all those other organisms that we just talked about, have good biodiversity in the soil, we're going to have some good activity all the way throughout the year in those soils, which is important. So, this is just kind of a representative, example of, basically how, we have sunlight, and the sun is obviously so important as a driving force of life on Earth, right? But, the plants are going to take up carbon dioxide, and, with water, those root exudates, and the photosynthates that are getting into the roots, all those sugars that are coming out there, they're going to be taken up by these soil organisms. And, all those root exudates are just going to be so important, because, that's going to be driving, nutrient cycling, soil aggregation, plant protection, detoxifying these soils as well too. So we talk again about these contaminants that are in there. If we have good soil organisms and a good mix of biota in there, then we're going to help to actually help detoxify potentially a lot of the soils. And then most important, frankly, for soil health is organic matter formation too. So, but again, the key thing on this is that, within the biological hotspot, we're going to talk about that here in a minute, is the rhizosphere. So just so important on how this all works. So, the continuous flow of carbon, and again, carbon is just the driving force of life, right? And so the flow of active organic matter, organic carbon, is the driving force of the microbial biomass and their activities. And so the reason it takes so long for organic matter to accumulate in the soil from crop residues, as an example, in cover crops and manure on the surface, is due in large part to the microbial respiration. And most of that respiration is turned to the atmosphere as CO2. But the key point is that, as you well know, that photosynthesis and plant root exudates, are so important in the system, and they're recognized as constituting the primary pathways for soil building with this. Okay, and so what we're kind of depicting here is the fact that, if you have a good, solid, a huge, healthy population of the microbial biomass, that's creating carbon, both, with living as well as the dead microbes in the system. It's kind of basically what we're calling kind of a microbial carbon pump, right? And so, again, photosynthesis and the root exudates, are driving the system in terms of feeding those microbes. And again, if you have a healthy soil system, soil ecosystem, it's really going to kind of get this whole carbon pump rolling. And you really need that to actually get this going. And so, tying in the critters that are the litter layers that are up in the litter layers, the macrofauna, as well as all the plant root exudates. This is what's going to contribute to the active carbon and the labile carbon in the system.
Hey, Joe, we have another question.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do we philosophically square the desire for improved soil health with the general dryness of the arid West? Irrigating the desert will improve soil health at that site, but are we actually making the world a better place in doing that?
That's a good question. And yeah, philosophically, that's each person's going to have a different thought. I agree. Are we going to be able to take a desert and make it where soil organic carbon is going to be high and storage? Probably not. So there are some offshoots of that, though, in the sense, and we'll talk about that here in a few more slides, that there are some things that we can do, and are we maximizing the system that we're actually working in. But no, totally understand that there are some inherent soil properties, climatic conditions that may make some of this tough, right? But that being said, as we'll dive into it here in a minute, again, what some of the practices that we are doing or are not doing could actually contribute to to a more healthy soil depending on the location. Hopefully that answers the question, but I agree. Some of this can be philosophical, right? So want to talk real briefly about some of the biological hotspots, kind of what we call the sphere of influence. And I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with this, but really wanted to kind of point out the fact that, there's just so many areas within the soil profile, primarily at the head, kind of the surface layers there that we call the hotspots. And these hotspots include the areas immediately around, immediately surrounding plant roots, which we call the rhizosphere. There's also the litter layer, and there's organisms that are strictly kind of in that layer as well, which are going to be breaking down that organic matter. There's residues, et cetera, on there. We've got the earthworms, as we're talking about, some of those bigger biological organisms that are going to be, creating these root channels or creating these channels that are going to help allow different the infiltration of water. They're mixing the carbon, they're mixing all the soil organic matter from that litter layer down into deeper areas. And again, talking about roots, right? The roots are so important as main drivers of this too. And we've also got various pore spaces in there as well too. And the pore spaces are so important in soil, biologically speaking, because again, that's going to be allow the exchange of oxygen as well as water infiltration into the soil too. And so the other big part of this is you can see the aggregate surfaces as well too. And again, that's just a biological hotspot in terms of where a lot of the microbes are associated with those aggregate surfaces too. So I just think of the aggregates can be even broken down even more so in terms of just those various pore spaces that are in there, and just all that creates the habitat. And there's just different functioning organisms that are associated with all that. But again, these are all biological hotspots in this profile of soil too that we need to kind of keep an eye out or have an understanding of, I should say. And again, getting back to some of our management practices, how those management practices affect these various hotspots and spheres of influence, as we call them. But again, so those are the ones that we're mainly talking about at this point in time. But really want to kind of talk again about how those hotspots relate to some of the chemical processes and regulators in pore space. And so you can see that as I go through here, so a healthy soil on the right-hand side, it has a good mix of mineral components, obviously the soil, but you've got good air pockets. You've got, water that's in their system as well too, which those organisms can both, utilize for moving around, but also to remain active, right? And so then the big part of that is the organic matter slice. Hopefully you can see that. But again, and then the biota with all those in place, are going to be, able to survive. We created habitat and they're able to utilize that. Contrast that to compacted soil, again, where most of that is going to be the mineral aspects of things. The air, as you well know, compaction in the air, those pore spaces are going to be reduced, right? And so water infiltration is going to be tight up, or going to be tight to get in there. So water flow, storage, and the availability is going to be reduced. So again, just kind of looking at this for how this is all kind of created. But again, the key thing on there is that, again, with these pore spaces, where water and air can go from literally the surface all the way down through there. They are the lungs in the circulatory system, having those spaces in place. So just want to kind of talk real briefly about how soil organisms physically stabilize soil aggregates. Again, the plant roots enmesh soil particles, so having that healthy living root in the system and in the soil is going to be important, because those plant roots, as you well know, are going to enmesh those particles. Earthworm casts, again, those are going to be so important as well too, because of all the biology that's associated with the earthworm casts as well too, that are both for bacteria and fungal activity as well. Also, the fungal and bacterial filaments can physically enmesh the soil particles. So just kind of think of that as a hairnet structure, and just think of how that hairnet would work and just enmesh those soil particles and kind of hold them together. And so these are just kind of some micrographs showing that, of how those bacterial filaments are holding those soil particles together. And so again, we're getting good aggregate stability by maintaining and improving the habitat of those areas, and utilizing the soil organisms to help create that, stabilize that area. So the big one, though, that we keep talking about is the rhizosphere, right? And so that's where the root exudates and the chemical signals stimulate microbes and the predators. And so the rhizosphere with a root system, that's where the anchoring happens. So obviously, those roots are going to keep the plant in the soil, help us prevent soil erosion, holds the stem upright too, obviously. But the rhizosphere is where water and dissolved minerals take place, and so storage in some of the root systems, with the starch, other nutrients, and so forth. But it provides habitat, right? It provides nutrients to the microbes, which help in the aggregation too. So again, it's pretty obvious, but how important the root system is, both for the plant, but just really talking about how it really facilitates an environment for all these soil microbes. And again, just talking about the diversity of those root systems, if possible, to have a diversity of taproots versus the fibrous root systems as well too. And just kind of looking at it from the aspect of the habitat that's creating for the different organisms down in the soil. So again, the rhizosphere, as you guys well know, again, the key organisms we're talking about and have been talking about are the bacteria, which are the most numerous. There's really just could potentially be millions and billions of bacteria organisms in a gram of soil. And so, the numbers are actually pretty staggering. And so I pulled some of the numbers, and as an example, we're talking about 1 gram of soil, again, can both just in bacteria, but a gram can contain 10,000 plus protists too, which are, again, they're another organism that, is microscopic as well. But just the quantity of the amount of organisms in a gram of soil is just pretty amazing. But 2 to 5% of the soil organic matter is there. It's responsible for 90% of the energy flow. Again, soil organic matter, carbon is so important. And again, right there, the 1 gram can contain 10 million bacteria and 1 million species. So the diversity is incredibly important, and is really impactful with the rhizosphere. And so the other part of that, the other organism that's key is fungi, right? And so we've got saprophytic fungi, but we've also got the mycorrhizae, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There are pathogenic fungi out there as well. So obviously everyone's well aware of some of the crop, some of those different disease organisms that are affected, by fungi. But so we do have those there as well too. But again, we're also talking about protozoa and nematodes, and the nematodes and the protozoa consume the microbes and recycle nutrients to plant roots. And so that's why their importance in the rhizosphere, and why they're key organisms in there too. We were talking there's a question in regards to, again, some of the inputs of chemicals, be it both inorganic fertilizers, pesticides, how they can affect them. And yes, they absolutely can. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But again, when you think about the different, organisms and their size, and how those different inputs can affect these organisms, they definitely can. The other thing I want to mention too is as important is the tillage systems too, or the disturbance systems that we're working in. Be it literally out in the field, crop field, but also could be in your garden too, right? So any type of tillage system with disturbance is going to reduce and change the environmental conditions, and so most of the time when you do that, it's going to favor bacteria, even though it's going to have some effect on the bacteria as well too. But again, the diversity of the other organisms is going to be reduced. Okay, so larger fauna, obviously like the nematodes, the mycorrhizal fungi, which is so important, the protozoa, they need those larger pore spaces. They need the aerobic soils and the right habitat to flourish. And so when we disturb it through tillage or any type of disturbance that way, we're changing those type of situations for them. And so again, you're going to get that reduction in the biodiversity going through there. So, but again, yeah, these other things such as chemical inputs as well as tillage can definitely affect these core key organisms as well. So you guys have all heard of mycorrhizae, but again, just talking about how important it is, and it's a Greek word and it means fungus root. Okay, and that's where it comes from. But most crops have mycorrhizal associations. As an example, like onions, corn, cotton, wheat, soybeans, potatoes, alfalfa, and just most of the vegetables, and just a bunch of other apples and grapes, and other trees are interlinked with mycorrhizae, and they need that. And plants use 5 to 20% of the carbon from photosynthesis to feed the fungi. And the fungi increase absorption root surface area by at least 10 times. And I got a pretty good shot of this, and I'll show you that. But that's why they're so important. The fungi can increase nutrient uptake, especially phosphorus and zinc. And then the fungi also suppress pests and diseases as well too when they're very healthy on there too. Now, not all plants have mycorrhizal associations. Brassicas are an example of a family that are non-mycorrhizal, but generally speaking, most plant species in the world have that association with the mycorrhizae. And so we'll kind of talk about how important that is here in a minute. But again, going back to the other inputs that are out there, it's important to kind of keep an eye out on and understand how those chemical inputs can make an effect on mycorrhizal associations, as well as some of the disturbance too. So again, they do have an effect. And the big key thing, fungal networks build soil aggregates, which are important. So I want to kind of dive in real briefly on kind of some of the nutrient management strategies that are currently in place. And there's some folks on this presentation that are nutrient management specialists and can give a really good deep dive onto how this works. But I wanted to kind of get your thoughts kind of going in more of an ecological matrix and how we kind of come up with a nutrient management strategy based on kind of a soil health management system. So, kind of the dominant nutrient management strategy that, we kind of have in place, and we call it kind of a paradigm, is kind of what we do on a majority of the croplands as an example. So as I'm going through this, basically what we're looking at is the fact that, we apply a lot of the nutrients, and then the soils can't hold those excess nutrients because they kind of come up with what we call leaky. Okay, and so the width of the arrows here are indicating the quantity of fertilizer applied. Okay, and so as a fertilizer, so we're talking some heavy nitrogen fertilizer applications. Generally speaking, in many cases above the recommended rates, based on soil tests and so forth. Again, it's changed a little bit, but nitrogen fertilizer, are kind of considered kind of a cheap fix, right? You want to put that out there, want to make sure that the plants have adequate nutrition, adequate nitrogen fertilizer uptake, for crop yields. But again, it's still a lot of input, nitrogen fertilizer. And so, as we're going through there's a large portion is taken up by the plants, but again, you still have a lot that's lost due to leaching and runoff, such as nitrogen and phosphorus. and also to the air too. We got to kind of keep that in mind as well too. Nitrogen does escape into the atmosphere that way too. So part of this though, in this paradigm, there's, as you can maybe see or not see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the plant and other residues are gone, right? So as we, we're looking strictly at putting nitrogen, phosphorus, fertilizers, those type of inputs into the system, but we're taking that off as, as the crop harvest. So there's really not much in the way of plant and other residues being put back into the system. And so with that, we're depleting soil organic matter. And as we keep talking about the soil organic matter and the soil life that's driving that utilization of soil organic matter. So the carbon balance is off here. And so, we're just kind of looking at the fact that, again, there's just a lot of, fertilizers and materials that are applied, they're not necessarily taken up and utilized. And so we have some different problems there. So with that, nationwide fallow land can be maintained for 4 to 8 months, providing limited food for soil life. And also we're talking about perennial systems with bare floors. There's also limiting for soil life too, right? So, again, there's not that plant residue out there. There's not that living root in the system. And so again, we have kind of a bare soil, and again, getting it back to the soil biology. There's nothing or very little to have the soil life actually feed upon, and actually just think of that habitat that's not there based on this.
Hey, Joe, we have one question.
Yep.
Where is nitrification in this diagram?
That's a good question. I'm going to keep on going through this and hopefully answer that question.
Great, thanks.
So many of you have heard the 4R nutrient management strategy, which is a really good strategy as well. And so the 4R strategy is the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right placement of nutrients. Okay, and so several methods that are included in this are side dressing, banding, split applications, and those kind of things. And so it's a great system, and we definitely recommend and highly promote that as well too, right? But when you kind of look at it from the ecological management standpoint of things, this is basically it increases the efficiency of the application, and it's kind of tweaking the previous strategy, but it's not necessarily building the capacity of the soil to keep it unchanged, right? So the nutrient loss and fixation is still high. Soil organic matter and soil life is still kind of depleting on this. So now again, basically it's a great strategy and one that we recommend, and it's just it works well, but at the same time, the fertilizer use efficiency is still not as strong as we could be. And so what they're talking about too in some of these different papers is that despite decades of effort, fertilizer use efficiency is still 50 to 60%, right? So depending on obviously the sources and placement and those kind of things too, there's a lot of different factors involved with that, but we still have the potential to, for both leaching, gas loss, as well as just runoff, some system problems in terms of the nutrients leaving the system and not being utilized by the plants. So again, same type of thing, right? And so again, a paper by Drinkwater and Snap from 2007, nitrogen fertilizer use efficiency still only about 40 to 60%. So got some things we need to talk about there. So let's talk about it real briefly in terms of an ecological nutrient management side of things. And so with that, what we're looking at basically talking about is kind of a holistic approach and tying in, kind of a combination of different things. But it's where we're hopefully going to be, looking at achieving, those high yields, maintaining that, but we're minimizing the fertilizer uses, and with that, ideally, reducing the environmental pollution. And so with that, the soil reservoirs from here, by utilizing cover crops and by utilizing the biology in the soil, we're looking at these fertilizer applications, and then those loss arrows, as you can see here, are narrower than the dominant and 4R strategy. And again, what we're saying is just that excuse me. with that, we're bringing, the carbon back into the system. We're increasing the soil organic matter and soil life, and we're utilizing nutrients from the plants and other residues. Again, cover crops, we're looking at manure, just a number of different inputs that way. Crop rotations, diversifying the crop rotations is going to be important in there too. And so, I guess the important part of this is that 85 to 90% of the plant nutrient acquisition is microbially mediated. So again, the soil biology drives this, right? So it's through this ecological nutrient management that's kind of based more on ecosystem based approach, and utilizing that to optimize organic and mineral reservoirs with longer residence times that will be accessed through microbial and plant mediated processes. And so the nutrient use efficiency can therefore, basically be improved through this process.
One more quick question.
Yep.
What is your opinion of biostimulant products?
It's a good question. I think that the little bit, and I'm not an expert on that by any stretch of the imagination, but I know some of them have shown scientifically that they will work. But I have seen other studies where, depending on the source and just a number of different factors of how it's created and made, kind of some different thoughts on that in terms of not necessarily being good, frankly, in terms of the quality of what they're getting for what they're paying on there too. But I think that there is a lot of work that's being done on the biostimulants, and some of the papers that I have read, have shown some positives. But again, I think it just really is depending on the quality of the product, the source that they're utilizing for those biostimulants, application rates, just a number of different things on there as well too. That I've seen both sides, to be quite honest with you, in some of the papers that I've read. But I am not an expert on that by any stretch of the imagination. And if anyone's got something and they want to put into the chat, that'd be great as well too. Like I say, good conversation.
Yeah, and we have one more question that came up. So a quick clarification: 85 to 90% of nutrient uptake by plant roots is due to microbial activity.
Basically, the acquisition, by the plant is microbially mediated.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So I want to kind of talk real briefly. I know we're running out of time, so apologize that. But just kind of talking about, and I think that was part of not necessarily talking about the nutrient cycle per se, but just in general, just kind of talking about mineralization versus immobilization. And so mineralization is the process by which microbes decompose the organic nitrogen from manure, compost, residues, those kind of things. And the rates of mineralization do vary with soil temperature, moisture, and the amount of oxygen in the soil. So there's some things associated with that too, right? Now, immobilization is the reverse of mineralization, and all living things require nitrogen, as we well know. And so, but the thing here is that the microorganisms in the soil compete, with the crops for nitrogen. And so immobilization refers to the process in which basically nitrate and ammonium are taken up by soil organisms and therefore become unavailable to crops. And so why do we want to talk about that is that, sorry about that, that, again, that there are, microbes, we need them to utilize and to mineralize, so that these forms of nitrogen can be, readily available for plant uptake. But at the same time, that if you do have this carbon nitrogen imbalance in the system, that the soil organisms will compete for nitrogen in the crop. So keeping that in mind in terms of, if you're looking at cover crops, or even just different crop rotations, to keep that in mind as well too. So it's really pretty important to kind of understand the carbon nitrogen ratio, and we'll get into that here in a minute too, if we have some time here. So, again, we're looking at the biological hotspots to optimize, the function. And again, just basically pointing out that, there's just all these different hotspots to keep in mind, as we're working in these systems. And so, again, these are just kind of some of the importance on here to kind of show, and again, the big thing here is that they're interrelated too. And so, But again, a lot of this is all driven by the root exudates, which is basically the material that's released from the plant roots, and it contains a variety of compounds, sugars, amino acids, fatty acids, glucose, and those kind of things that are so important for bacterial growth. And so with bacterial growth, you're getting these other organisms that are feeding on the bacteria, and hence the cycle starts from there. Again, getting back to the mineralization rates, just wanted to kind of talk about again why it's so important and how it's microbially driven on here. Again, I know we have a lot of folks that are working in cover crops, including our own NRCS folks, but just really wanted to show the understanding that plant species growth and the stage that they're at and the relationships to that with carbon and nitrogen ratio is key to coming up with a strategy, right? And again, how important the soil microbial processes actually work, and will kind of can be affected by the different plant materials in here too. So this is a chart that we talk about, but a key part of that is the ideal microbial diet is a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 24:1. And so as you start increasing on this chart, you got rice straw at the very top, and so 82:1, and so that's going to be decomposition rate is going to be a lot slower, as opposed to when you start going down to the very bottom part of this chart. As an example, hairy veg cover crop, you talk about 11:1. And so anyway, those microbes are really going to kind of work on that because the carbon nitrogen ratio is low. And so you're going to get some flushes in the system based on that, as opposed to a little bit more of the carbon nitrogen ratio on the higher end, where you're going to get a diversity of bacteria as well as fungi breaking that material down. Okay, we're running out of time here, but really want to talk real briefly. Again, a lot of you guys know about the phosphorus cycle, but just want to kind of touch base and show that there's a lot of aspects of and how important phosphorus is to plant growth. And so plants utilize phosphorus for a number of different things. And so such as flowering. Fruiting is tied into that, including seed production, maturation. It's needed in large amounts for meristematic tissues and primarily, definitely for root growth as well too, as among other things too. Phosphorus is readily tied up in a lot of our soils though, and also in some of the different lower pH ranges too. And so, these factors that make it limited to plants. And it can also be tied up by other things such as calcium and magnesium, kind of at the higher pH range. So it's generally kind of thought that phosphorus is probably the most difficult major element to make available for plant use on here too. So what this is just kind of showing is that on the very far right hand side, we've got organic phosphorus. And those, form include, dead and annual plants, as an example, and residues, soil microorganisms. So that's kind of the organic phosphorus. Inorganic phosphorus is, plant available, but it's phosphorus dissolved in water, soil solution, and it's can be available to plants. But an inorganic phosphorus basically exists in three phases too, 3 pools. And another one is comprised of inorganic phosphorus, which is attached to clay surfaces, iron and aluminum and calcium oxides, and it's released slowly. So that's kind of a key thing here too. And then there's also the mineral phosphorus, which is primary and secondary phosphate minerals in the soil, and their release rate is extremely slow too. So again, those are the kind of the three main pools of inorganic phosphorus, as opposed to the organic phosphorus, which is readily available too. And so you can see here that the absorption side of that, with the arrow going towards the plant, that's a process in which phosphorus present in the soil solution is attached and bound to the surface of the soil particles, whereas desorption is a process where adsorbed phosphorus can released into the soil solution and available for plant uptake on there too. And so, again, part of the whole thing is the fact that it's going to take some biology to get this through the system, and this is very simplified too based on time. So, but again, just showing that utilizing biology, we can make that inorganic phosphorus more available to the plants by utilizing the biology. And just talking real briefly here, again, of how important those plant roots are to, attracting those microbes. And again, having that into the system, right? And so the exudates, carbohydrates, and proteins are secreted by the roots. Okay, and that's going to attract the bacteria, and then from the bacteria, that's going to attract the nematodes and the protozoa, which are going to consume the bacteria and mineralize nutrients for plants. So what we're talking about here is that by utilizing the biology, bacteria and fungi are like little fertilizer bags. Okay, and so utilizing that, the root exudates, and again, having the combination of roots in the system as long as possible, and the diversity of roots, that's what's going to be important on there too. But again, utilizing the bacteria to drive this thing. So we talked briefly about the arbuscular mycorrhizal associations, and just in general the mycorrhizae and why it's so important on there too. But I think this is a pretty telltale slide in the showing that the advantages of having the mycorrhizal root colonization on there. And just, you can see on the left-hand side, that root that is not colonized by mycorrhizae. And you can kind of see the limited area that is going to be utilized or able to be utilized by the root hairs, and hence phosphorus uptake and so forth, as opposed to the mycorrhizal fungi hyphae, which is extending all the way into the soil system there too. With mycorrhizae, we're talking about phosphorus here in this example, but there's also a nitrogen uptake benefit. There's also been observed, plant water uptake as well too. And so, as we're getting some of these drier conditions, having that association in there can actually help improve, with water plant uptake as well too. With that, and one of the important things too that we're talking about with the mycorrhizae association is the improvement of aggregates, okay, because they're actually enmeshing the soil particles through their exudations too. And so the other big thing is that hyphae can of different plants can connect, and it creates a network between the plants. And so again, just a really important association that hopefully we can build upon and promote within the soil system that we're working in. Just real briefly in terms of how the biology is important in the for even pest control. Okay, and so this is just kind of showing there's a study that was done that showed roots with springtails, collembola, and what they did is actually ate some of the rhizoctonia, which is a damping off disease. And so you can see the association with how strong the roots are compared with utilizing the springtails and having them as part of the system as opposed to the roots without it. And the rhizoctonia actually affected those root systems too. So again, biology helping out here, right? There's also the nematode trapping fungi, which are pretty incredible to see those. And then here's a mite preying on a nematode. So again, utilizing the biology for pest management. Okay, and so here's another protist eating a fungal root pathogen involved in take all disease too. So key thing here, a single protozoa can eat billions of bacteria each day. So really kind of important stuff. Again, just really kind of emphasizing the fact that if you utilize bacteria in the system, if you utilize the soil microbes, all the invertebrates in the system, plants do actually, communicate within that soil atmosphere. And so again, by having a healthy biology and healthy soil system, you're really helping out the plants. You get a healthy plant on there too. So last thing I want to talk about, and this hopefully gets back to what we're talking about for some of these other arid systems. You guys have all seen the water cycle and how important it is for soil health. We really want to kind of clue in on the infiltration part. Okay, and so also, as we're looking at climate change and how things are getting warmer and drier, particularly even in these areas as well too, the importance of the water cycle and what we can actually affect within that water cycle. And a lot of that has to do with infiltration. Okay, and so the big key thing here to take home is that by improving soil aggregates in the system and increasing those pore spaces, allowing that water to actually infiltrate into the soil profile as opposed to ponding or running off. So soil aggregate stability is important for all these type of functions, and that is one thing that we actually can work on. So just real briefly, how can we feed below ground life? Again, choose practices that provide diverse near continuous inputs and build soil organic reservoirs. And again, big thing here, provide and protecting that habitat too, and just to kind of keep that in mind too, of building the soil aggregates, improving and increasing the soil organic matter in the system. We're talking about for the four principles of soil health, different plant species, varieties, and making sure that living roots in there. promoting and practicing the 4 R's when you do fertilize. The inputs of soil amendments, can work, and including the biologicals too, and manage the environment to minimize stress, to keep that plant healthy, through temperature, moisture, and maximum presence. And so again, just kind of talking about how we want to, tying into our 4 principles of soil health, how that all works, right? And so, again, we've talked about this question. Many fertilizer concentrations can be too high for symbiosis, as well as just actually killing, the bacteria and changing the fungi concentration there as well too. Just want to point out on my last slide here that there are some lab indicators that can be used for soil health, and that's some of them there. And I think the Oregon State Soil Health Lab actually runs some of these tests as well too. So instead of just looking at NPK and ECs and those kind of things too, there are some indicators that you can kind of look at and use for soil health. And with that, I am done. I apologize for going over.
Thanks, Joe. We do have one question. We'll try and sneak it in really quick
Okay.
before they kick us back out to the main room. There's been an observation of a high level of disconnect between these principles and the practical implementation of annual crop management in a way that respects soil health. In particular, effective no-till, chemical-free cover crop termination at the most beneficial growth stage on a scale larger than a garden is particularly challenging. Litter, while containing many benefits, can also support significant slug populations, challenging the establishment of your subsequent crop. How do you recommend navigating these very practical crop management issues while still promoting soil health principles?
Yeah, good question. And there is a lot to that. And so just real briefly, one of the things that we're talking about potentially is, crop rotation, maybe changing up, that crop into that cropping system itself too. The other thing too is we kind of tell folks that are looking at implementing some of these principles of soil health, start off small, do some trials, because it's exactly right. There's a lot of it that is, it's going to take some challenge. And it's going to take some tweaking to the system to actually get there. And so we always say, just to leave it off, that soil health is a journey, not a destination. And so, yeah, there's a lot of variables out there, but there's some of the principles can be utilized. And, we just kind of say, hey, don't go out there. If you got 1,000 acres, our recommendation is don't go whole hog into 1,000 acres. Do some trials, work with NRCS folks, work with cooperative extension folks, the university, and, your own. There's a lot of good growers out there that are already implementing some of these systems too, and just kind of, they've got some really good tweaks. Ask them, have them be your mentor. But yeah, again, just to kind of utilize that, the fact that it's a journey, not a destination, right? So there's a lot of variables, and so yeah, I totally understand that you may not be able to go in whole hog, do all 4 principles all at one time, but at least starting to kind of implement a few of those from the beginning, just to get your feet wet is probably a good way to go.
Thanks so much, you guys. I think Corey is going to bump us back into the larger group here in about 30 seconds or so. Thanks so much, Jericho, for being such a great moderator of the chat. And Joe, I don't know if you're taking a look at the chat, but lots of really great both questions and saying you did a great presentation. Now we're back in the larger group.
And I'll stop recording now.
Thank you.